When we think about the other world, we tend to do so from the perspective of this world. What is this hidden world that seems to operate so differently from our own? Who are the beings who dwell there, and what do they want with us? In J.M. Hamade's fascinating book, Procession of the Night Theater, they explore the night side of astrology, offering a poetic vision of the lunar stations, not to be defined or calculated so much as dreamed with. It's this study of the nocturnal side of things, the hidden side of things, that not only eloquently elucidates the ancient art of working with the lunar mansions, but also weaves expertly into the tapestry of Jay's many other occult and appropriately otherworldly interests. The lunar stations, and working with them to divine or make talismans, or even just pair with horror movies, opens the practitioner up to considering how understanding both daytime and nighttime approaches to magic and astrology can teach us about the visible and hidden, the exoteric and esoteric aspects of ourselves, the world, and what is beyond. As Jay points out in the conversation, the Muslim name for those who dwell in the other world is jinn, which translates to being hidden and also in something of a state of change or flux. Furthermore, Jay mentions a fascinating hot take from the 13th century Sufi mystic Ibn Arabi, who interpreted humans and jinn as exoteric and esoteric counterparts to one another. When we take a cross-cultural view of beings like the jinn, the Aeshi of the Gaels, the elves of the Norse, the Vila of the Balkans, the Lamiak of the Basque, just to name a few, it's fascinating to notice how, as these cultures transition to more structured, monotheistic cosmologies, their perspectives on these esoteric beings becomes increasingly antagonistic. I would be remiss to try to whitewash or philosophically domesticate these beings of the other world. I could hardly imagine a less morally delineated dimension, similar to how nothing about ourselves is ever really black or white. But if doing this show has taught me anything, it's that understanding this realm, if not working with it directly, is still a meaningful pursuit. When you examine groups on the fringes of these monotheistic religions and cultures that exist within the larger cosmology but navigate it differently, you often encounter spiritual relics from the distant past. Sects like the Zahar of Northeast Africa, the Sojmanka of Eastern Serbia, and religions such as Kimbanda in Brazil all incorporate trance possession by beings that would be considered jinn in the wider Middle East. What are we to make of this vastly different view, both of these beings, and why and how one might engage with them? Jay's book and insights have had a deep impact on how I consider big questions like these, and helped me to shape my own ideas about what we can really know about the other world and its role in this world. J.M. Hamade of Star Night Dwell and many wonderful books and projects. Welcome to Radical L Fam. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Hi, thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
Hell yeah. So, a bit of an icebreaker question. I'm curious if you can remember a moment in your life where magic became real for you, or if maybe you were one of those lucky people who were born into a magical way of thinking.
I have a little bit of both. I think the first time that it was after the fact. It was after it happened. But people in my family, it's not just me, people in my family, especially on my mother's side, my family, which is the Mexican side of my family, have a knack for seeing dead people and ghosts and spirits. I was very very young, and I was at my grandparents' house, and I looked at, they had like a little courtyard out front of their house, and it was like a very, I remember it so clearly. think maybe I was 5 or 6 years old, and I looked outside in that courthouse, and it was a very, very misty day. It was in the middle of the day, but it was very like misty and wet outside and gray. And I looked out into the courtyard, and I saw an old, very old woman standing at the gate to the courtyard. And she was looking into the courtyard, and she had like a shawl and of like gray hair. And I said to my mother and my grandmother, I said, hey, like who is, there's a woman waiting at the gate. And they came over, and they kind of like, they were like, oh, there's no one there, there's nobody standing there. And at that time, I was so young, I didn't really comprehend the full weight of it. But later on, it was like, oh yeah, no, you were like seeing people who weren't there, who were probably, spirits of some kind. And then other, especially younger children in my family, would see the same spirits. Oftentimes they would
Mm.
describe them the same way. And people in the family had different reasons or stories for why that would be the case. But my grandmother, who was a hospice aide, not quite a nurse, but basically a hospice aide for about 30 years, she loved Edgar Cayce. She collected books on astral travel and all kinds of paranormal phenomena. And from a very young age, I would go through her library at that same house and kind of, I guess, began contextualizing things that I was seeing and other things that people were talking about. And then on that same side of my family, I have spiritism, like Latin espiritismo, like mesa blanca, white table spiritism. And that's something that actually my great grandparents practiced back in Mexico. And so sort of thing, especially on that side of my family, is there culturally, and something that people practice, as well as something that I experienced from a young age. And so it's kind of like, oh, okay, there's another world, and there's other beings that kind of populate it, but also move back and forth between the worlds in that way.
That's fascinating. Oh my God. I'm curious, is that ability to see spirits tangibly, not just mind's eye type visual, is that something that kind of faded, something you've had to try to get back, or has that been a through line?
I think the society we live in oftentimes intentionally tries to kill that part of us.
Hmm.
And a lot of the people in my family who I know saw spirits and things when they were young, just like a lot of children, I think, just out in the world in general, because kids and the kind of openness that they have. But many of those same family members, I've asked them later on as they've gotten older, oh, have you still seen things and whatnot? And many of them would say, no, I don't see anything like that anymore. Maybe would even actively deny what they saw when they were younger. And so for me personally, I think I had a lot of that, where I was just taking in the society around me, which was like, that stuff's not real. There was a time where, yeah, I would deny the things that I was seeing, even still into my teenage years and whatnot. But yeah, as I got older, I think as I started to get back into all of this stuff, magic, occultism, etc., that side of me started coming back. And yeah, I would say that sight is still intact. Although, yeah, I don't as much, at least publicly, get into the intricacies of that. But yeah, I would say that I've rekindled many of the things that were a part of who I was as a kid, but also I think a part of who many children are as a kid. And for me, much of that rekindling is not even a woo-woo thing. It's actually even closer to being an artist and a creative person, because and I'm sure maybe we'll get into it later, I guess, like cosmology, my metaphysical beliefs, my religious beliefs are, I was raised Muslim, especially on the non-Mexican side of my family. And there's certain mystical thinkers such as Ibn Arabi, who, he wrote on the Lunar Mansions, and he emphasized more than anything else the imagination, or what we call in English the imagination. And I don't see a distinction between the imagination and the spirit world. And I've talked with many incredible mediums who, you talk with them about how to cultivate mediumship and spirit sight and things like that. And I'm like, that's some of the same shit they taught me in art school.
Hmm.
um, it's so much of it is about getting in touch with your body and your senses. And so, yeah, I don't see that distinction there. And I think a cultivated spirit sight oftentimes looks less like quote unquote paranormal or quote unquote supernatural and more just like being an artist. And so I give more credit to that, even though I, of course, do my fair share of imbibing of occult and esoteric everything.
I love that. I think that's an interesting way to maybe describe what communicating with a spirit would be like to somebody who is not into the occult. Would be, well, if you've experienced true inspiration in your life, something that seems to come from someplace you don't know, that's a similar experience to being able to get information or communication or even a visual from that world too. So I love that comparison between those two. Some people might see that as different from the outside, but it makes sense to me as well that they'd be the same place, really.
Exactly, exactly. And all the, I shouldn't say all, but I would say so many of the ancient cultures that we're familiar with, they understood creativity to be just that, right? It was
Hmm.
spirit inspiration. And this wasn't coming from oneself only, right?
Yeah.
One was a conduit or a vessel
Mm-hmm.
to be
Yep.
inspired.
Yeah. Oh my God, I love that. So you mentioned the Mexican portion of your family that seems very open to the spiritual world. Was there any conflict with the Muslim side, or was that combination of cultures mutually supportive of that type of worldview?
Somewhat, I tell people often. So I'm Lebanese on the other side of my family, and we're Shia. So we actually come from a minority in Islam. You know, minority groups have minority complexes around things, but also people who are perceived more as other, think end up getting associated with practices that are considered other, whether they actually, do engage with those things or not. That's, I think, the nature of otherness or magic, witchcraft, any of these kinds of things, right? It's so much to do with perception of the other, capital O, other. And when I was a little kid, they were already putting evil eye amulets and all this stuff on me from a very young age, that's common in Latin culture as much as it is in many, Arabic, Muslim, Middle Eastern, North African, etc., etc. So that's not even anything like special or unique by any means. But yeah, I mean, I think Lebanese people are maybe a little bit more open to some of those things than other countries in the region without getting too prejudicial about it. And I had exposure to those things, but nothing I would say too explicit around like spirit contact or anything like that. But I also wouldn't say that those sides were contradictory in that way. Where I would say more so there's similarities in that the Mexican Catholic side of my family and the Muslim side of my family both, at least, religiously and culturally acknowledge the spirit world as just a given. Even people who would call themselves, secular, maybe not atheists, but like secular modern people still acknowledge the existence of the spirit world. And so for Muslims, it's the jinn, which I'm sure we'll also talk more about throughout. But jinn are just intertwined with the everyday reality of all Muslim people. To be a Muslim, you have to believe in the jinn and the reality of the jinn, because it's an incredibly important component of the Quran, the holy text. God says the jinn are very real. So to deny their existence would be to deny the word of God. And you'd be hard pressed to find a Muslim who won't even, in a moment of like accident or illness, or, somebody looks at them the wrong way or whatever, who wouldn't talk about the evil eye or the jinn or something like that. So it's really all pervasive, but it's just something that it's subtle and people don't always talk about it openly. And oftentimes it could be sort of like intercultural thing, or like people who are from that culture would get talked about, but maybe not in like a super public way. Um, yeah,
That's fascinating. Yeah. I have a lot of questions about the jinn for you, but I wanted to start out by talking about your book a little bit because that's
sure.
why I want to have you on. I just finished Procession of the Night Theater, which I loved, and it's interesting hearing you describe your diverse background and different cultures that you were raised within. Because part of what I really loved about this book was just the wide breadth of information you're compiling, and then through your writing, parsing it experientially. You're summarizing of all these different aspects of different cultures' views of the lunar stations. I think you're a very perfect person to write this type of book. So maybe just to start off for people who have not read the book yet, just a bit about it and maybe how you approached writing about the lunar stations.
Sure. So I I learned about the lunar stations. Well, it's I'll give like a brief background to how I came to the lunar stations in the first place. I lived most of my teenage years, I would say, in that kind of like secular worldview. But I was like a like a punk heavy metal kid throughout my from like 12 to 19, or I still am in many respects. That's like core to, maybe not in an outward way, but anyways. And then I finally went to undergrad and I took a class on Islamic mysticism. The professor was Muhammad Azadpour. He's Iranian. Incredible class. I think I was like 20 years old. I was already like at that time of getting into, I was already like deep into Western esotericism, like the Golden Dawn, Aleister Crowley, Eliphas Levi, all this kind of stuff. But I didn't have as much of a grounding in actually these practices and beliefs in my own cultures. And I took that class and I was like, wow, these things exist in with my religious upbringing that I had. And it took me a long time to sort of come back to, what was always there in my roots. And so going more deeply into Islamic mysticism, I discovered figures like Ibn Arabi, right? And then Ahmed al-Buni later, and many others, Sufism, all this sort of stuff. And you can't, well, I don't think you can get into any of that and not discover the Lunar Mansions, because you find them approached from every angle, some very practical, which is like, I use this lunar mansion to cut my hair, and I use this lunar mansion to speak with people in authoritative positions, all the way to, Ibn Arabi, like the procession through the lunar mansions being this kind of mystical system or way to describe these mystical grades, right, of initiation, but also of coming to know the divine. And so I became fascinated with the lunar mansions from both angles. And as I had already been studying astrology, I wanted to find what was the astrology from my own culture. And it seemed like the lunar mansions were the closest thing to that. And there's a lot of other, I guess you could call it, scholarly information. There's a lot of also not scholarly information in the book that, so information about the lunar mansions that comes from cultures that are not the Muslim peoples, the Arabic speaking peoples, which is the thing I would say I'm most familiar with, and that is a part of my own ancestry, besides some of the more like quote unquote Western magical material, which there is some of that in there as well. A lot of people don't know that even in the Western magical tradition, beyond Agrippa getting things from the Picatrix, there's various grimoires by, cunning people that talk about the lunar mansions. And some of that is in the book as well. But I'm also bringing in information about the Vedic nakshatras, the Chinese shu or lunar lodges, as well as a variety of sources that I could find, mostly in English, based on the lunar mansions from different cultures. And I tried to not overly interpret that information, especially from cultural paradigms that are not mine to speak to, but more so just to pass on the information that, hey, someone wrote about the lunar mansion from this perspective, and then just cite the source for it. So a good chunk of the book is encyclopedic. And this is what I call the daytime chunk of the book. And I wanted to write the book from a daytime perspective, which is more of that, like how most books on astrology are written. And then I wanted to write it from a nighttime perspective. And this is where, as you said, I wrote from my own experience, and I wrote the lunar mansions through poetic prose, through a kind of like vignette fiction, like a kind of microfiction, as well as through poetry. And so each lunar mansion, forming its own poem, its own little narrative that partakes of a larger narrative of moving through all 28 of the lunar mansions. And so I think that's probably a good segue into even what the lunar mansions are, which is, it's not one thing, and all of those different cultures that I mentioned that have their own versions of the lunar mansions, it's exactly that. They have their own versions. But if you're going to take a step back and look at how they've been, I would say, codified between all these different cultures, or standardized is maybe a better word. The night sky in astrological practice, it's a 360-degree circle. And so you can think about the circular natal chart that I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar with. And the 12-sign zodiac, right? Aries through Pisces is the best example that most people have of a breakdown of that circle into 12 signs of 30 degrees each. So the lunar mansions are just another breakdown, or the lunar stations, as I call them, are just another breakdown of that 360-degree circle. The difference being, unlike the zodiac of the sun, those 12 signs, or 13 if you listen to people like Neil deGrasse Tyson and astrophysicists, that this is a zodiac based on the 4 stations of the sun, and the seasons primarily, and the solstices and equinoxes, and was perhaps at one time more so rooted in the stars, and in Vedic astrology to some extent still is, which we can maybe get into the differences between sidereal and tropical later, and the technical reasons behind that. But that zodiac is based around the sun. So that's the daytime perspective that I wanted to write, which is what most people use. But the lunar mansions are based around the moon, hence lunar. And so there's an inherent connection to the stars, because we see the moon at night when the stars are visible. And the example that I always use for people in my presentations is I show a picture of the sun at day, where you can't see any stars except for the sun, which is a star. And people forget that. It's the only star allowed to be in the sky at that time. And then I show a picture of night, where you see the moon surrounded by stars. And so through this, I think, very kind of didactic way of teaching, you can see that the moon, if we're going to look at it imagistically, represents plurality, multiplicity, and a holding space for the many others in that way, for that same capital O, other, in the way that a more solar way of thinking, I think, I don't want to say doesn't allow for, but is less open to, right? And so we get more of what we would call rational or objective forms of thinking from this kind of solar consciousness, which, once again, I think most astrology in modern times is written that way. And so part of the book is still that, because I still think that way, or we could think about our right and left sides of the brain, however you want to do that, right? But the more important side of the book to me is that more right right brain way of going about it, where I'm experiencing the lunar stations directly, and filtering them through my poetic lens and this sort of thing. So I mentioned station and why I prefer lunar station. I think that's important. Mansion comes from the Arabic word mansil, which does actually translate to mansion. But there can be other ways of interpreting it, and it's in reality it's something more like way station, where you could think about, and this is the metaphor that I use in the book. You could think about a caravanserai or like a lodge where a group of travelers would stop for the night to protect themselves from thieves and the dangers of sleeping out in the wilderness at night. And these caravanserai were portioned just about a day's travel apart from each other, across the world, all the way from China to North Africa and onward. And people at these places would stay together and meet new people from other places, and they would gather and they would tell stories, right? And so many of these stories that were told became like similarly standardized or codified into like what we would call the 1001 Nights, right? But also many of the associations around things like the lunar mansions and the kind of, if you want to call it proto-astronomy, or you could call it astrology, and the sharing of this kind of information, right? Like people may not call it scientific per se, but for that time it would be considered as such. And the exchanging of texts as well, right? As well as other commercial goods. And these were trade routes that people were navigating. And so the moon is like Mercury, associated with trade, with commerce, and with travel in this way. So the moon, more than anything else, is a traveler. And for the book, I situated my own consciousness in that position of being the moon. So I am the moon traveling through the night sky as if I am on one of these caravanserai journeys, right? And stopping in these different caravanserai. And each one is a lunar mansion. Each one is a lunar station, right? Station because I'm stopping, but if it was a mansion, I would be staying, because you want to stay in a mansion, right? No one gets into a mansion and they're like, I just want to get out. They're like, I want to get comfortable. I want to eat all of this expensive food. I want to swim in the infinity pool, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a station because you stop and then you get up and you go soon after. It's very temporary. It's temporal. It's about time and the passing of time. And so for the night side portion of the book, the lunary part of the book, that I am the moon moving through these different stations, and each station and the characters, the personalities that are being encountered, right? These are the different stars and the different cultural images that accumulate around these asterisms, the lunar station, but kind of anthropomorphized, let's say, or turned into story. And so I am encountering them as I'm moving through, and each station has different stories to tell, depending on how you're encountering it, what kind of cultural paradigm is most present, because it's very different depending on the culture and their perception of the stars. Just as one culture could see a grouping of stars as being very dark and spooky and dangerous, and a different culture could be like, no, those are like our northern star. They guide us home to our place of comfort. And so cultural relativity, just like the moon and the night sky, allows for that multiplicity and plurality. We see an inherent cultural relativity here that unlike a lot of astrologers who go around telling everyone what to think and that there's only one right way to do things, getting into the lunar mansions is like, no, there's a multiplicity of ways of approaching things, which I think begs the question of creativity. So anyways, I know that was a very multiplicitous way of responding to that question.
Very appropriately. Oh, I love it. That was great. I like whenever I can ask one question and then have like my next six answered without having to say anything. That is perfect. I find that often in the modern magical world, when you hear lunar stations brought up, it's typically from the perspective of trying to work talismanic magic. And it's not to say that that's not an excellent practice to engage in, but it seems like from your perspective, this whole dreaming with the moon, encountering stories, it seems like for you, what you can get out of engaging with the lunar mansions goes much further than that.
Yeah.
So I'm curious what you
Yeah.
think people might be missing if they stop at talismanic magic as the only way they encounter the lunar mansions.
Well, I've become known in my personal circles of magical people, maybe not known in a public way, but at least with people that I know, for one particular rant, and it has to do with the Picatrix, which the
Mm-hmm.
Arabic name is the Ghayat al-Hakim, the goal of the wise, or the goal of the sage, which, because I was a part of the publishing of the Shams Ma'arif, which is like the most notorious book of magic in the Arabic speaking world. And I don't have too much time to really get into that. That's its own whole other thing. But going through the process of publishing that book and just learning more about the history, and going more deeply into my own culture, I really realized how, at least for Arabic speaking people and Muslim people, really how, and this is going to sound maybe a little crass, but how irrelevant the Picatrix is to that world. It's incredibly important for the, post Latin, Spanish and Latin translation, and then through Agrippa, as I mentioned, in this kind of transmission, for the quote unquote Western magical world, for sure. There's no doubt about its importance. But I think in like the day-to-day use of people from that Arabic speaking Muslim world, North Africa, the Middle East, and much further onward as far as that culture spread, it's not something you see really all that much. And I think the context that it was written in, attests to that, because it's a very actually scholarly work and is pulling from many, many, many different texts, as the author says as much. And so because of this kind of like, I want to say almost ivory tower sensibility or approach that it was made in, its accessibility to everyday people is hampered significantly, and the kinds of magic that it's used for and has become associated with has a complexity. And not to say that everyday people don't do complex things, but it has a kind of complexity, especially a mathematical complexity, that I think people don't realize before we had computers to be able to do all these astrological calculations were much more challenging to do, right? And took a lot of like literacy and textual knowledge and mathematics to be able to do so. Whereas now people do these kinds of talismanic elections that you're talking about, really because they have computers to be able to do most of that work for them, to get to that level of precision, right? And many of those elections require a fair bit of precision. And so this rant that I've become known for is like, look, in that world that it emerges from originally, it started as an Arabic text, but in that world, it's not really an important book for magic, really at all. And I think that what I just described is the reason for that. And so, number one, what you're missing when you're interacting with it just in that way is that the religious, more than anything, the religious aspect of it is completely devoid. Islam has been taken out. If any of you, by you I mean you or your listeners, have studied poetry or literature at all, this is something that only recently people have spoken more about in regards to Rumi, the poet Rumi,
Mm.
but a lot of other Sufism in general, which is that there has been a systematic elimination of Islam, the religion itself, from Rumi, from Sufism. And this is, I think, whether it's conscious or not, because of Islamophobia. People aren't always aware of it, but I think when it comes down to it, it's what it is. Once again, whether it's conscious or not. And this is a similar case, except it's a much older Islamophobia that goes back into things like the Inquisition, right? Which similarly saw the systematic elimination of Semitic peoples Jews, Muslims, from the same part of the world, the Iberian Peninsula and onward, of course, but especially around there, where this kind of intellectual, brew with Ibn Arabi, as well as the Picatrix, the Ghayat al-Hakim, was actually occurring, right? So this is not an accident here at all. So you're not getting any of that. And as far as an Arabic or like a Muslim understanding of the lunar mansions, it's so important for the mystical and the magical understanding of it, of these talismanic images. So you're getting something which has been filtered multiple times, as well as something which has been, I would say, completely secularized, right? So it's like, what's an example? It's like, trying to do something with a Catholic saint without anything and without any Catholicism or something. So, but it's kind of become its own thing. But I would say what you're giving up more than anything else is that theological dimension. But I think that's giving up a lot with it, and you're also doing something that I think is ahistorical as well, and grounded much more in what we'd call the Western magical tradition than in Arabic forms of magic or Islam, which part of that same rant is that the way that the lunar mansions were used, like really how all astrology was done for most of human history, was that people looked up at the sky and they looked at what was happening in the sky at that time. They looked at what stars were around the moon. And many of these same images that people use in the talismanic imagery in these texts, like the Picatrix, they come from early constellational imagery. And as far as I'm concerned, that's just a fact. That's just a fact. And that's also their connection to geomancy. So if you open up my book, you'll also see geomantic correspondences with the different lunar mansions. And some of them absolutely are more of a stretch, no doubt. But the early authors and the early Al-Mawsili, this machine is actually in the British Museum. I saw it when I was in London last year. I think this was the 18th century. Don't quote me on that, but he created a machine in brass that created geomantic charts. You could turn a wheel on this brass machine and it made geomantic charts. And there were lunar mansion correspondences with the geomantic figures on this machine. And this is one of the primary sources that scholars have used to derive these correspondences. But I think I've made a pretty good case for at least a few of them, that these correspondences come from in the older proto-astronomical texts. It's kind of proto-astronomy, where people were once again just looking up at the sky and drawing how constellations looked, how the asterism looked, usually in these kind of dot shapes, that these associations came from these dot figures. So this constellation looks like this geomantic figure. And I put a few examples in the book. And so these images, these dot assemblages, right? Or even the kinds of images that were associated with that constellation, in the same way that we look up at Aries and we see a ram, even though it just looks like a bent stick in the sky. This kind of constellational lore, this is where the images come from for these image magic texts and for these talismanic images. So if you're just drawing them for your own magical practice, it's not to say it won't work. I'm not saying that. But if the question is, what are you losing when you're just kind of copying what Agrippa says, as an example, like, draw this image in this lunar mansion, you're missing all of that rich lore and history, and you're missing the religion. And I would say, even on the technical side of it, that the Western magical interpretation of the lunar mansions has gone mostly with tropical astrology. But if we're talking about looking up in the sky and where the moon, what stars are around the moon at that period of time, as well as acknowledging that the star magic for many cultures, including a lot of even European witchcraft traditions, is about being able to literally see the star in the sky to do things like being able to get the starlight in water and practices such as this, which I think more like witchcraft oriented people would be familiar with this kind of thing, then we can acknowledge the importance of a sidereal vantage point here. And so I talked earlier about this distinction between tropical and sidereal. Sidereal is the word itself is a reference to a star-based clock. Sidereal meaning like of the stars. And so I think people who do it that way are missing that as well. They're missing this direct connection with the night sky and with the stars, which for many people was actually a part of making that magic have efficacy, have power.
That's a very great answer. I love that. You brought up sidereal and tropical and these types of things. This is a bit of a daytime question. I'm just curious, how do you see the efficacy of tropical and sidereal in terms of divination or chart readings? Do you think one is better than the other? Do you think they're kind of like separate languages that have evolved on different paths and have like equal say at certain truths? How do they both work, or do you think one of them doesn't work as well?
I think they both work, and it's very much the latter in that
Mm-hmm.
they're just different ways of going about it, different paths, as you said, that have their own efficacy to them. I and there's different reasons that I think that. One being, or I guess the two most important reasons. One being that I see astrology as being no different than divination. I see astrology as divination. Jeffrey Cornelius, who wrote a great book on that, he passed away recently. Astrology is divination in the same manner as tarot cards for me, in the same manner as throwing beans and geomancy. And I always go back to the history for these things. So it's mostly established by scholars, though of course this isn't 100% agreed upon, that most of what we call Western astrology comes from Babylon and Mesopotamia, in terms of the 12 zodiacal signs and much of the kind of angles and exaltation, these kinds of things. Astrology was not their primary form of divination. It was extipacy, I think it's pronounced. I just call it extra spicy because I think it's funny, but it's divination using a liver. So an animal would be sacrificed, and the
Mm.
entrails and the liver would be pulled out, and it would be red, right? And then so the omens, and they were more so known in Babylonian Mesopotamian astrology, more so known for their omen practices. The omen would then confirm, deny, add nuance to this much more like ground on the ground form of divination, right? Because you might have to wait a really long time for a star to do a certain thing. That's another part of the kind of image magic talismanic thing. It's like you might have to wait a really long time to get that election. And so, of course, people need answers now, back then and now, and they always have. And something like that, just like a tarot card reading, is like, oh, you just flip a card, right? It's something that's accessible. The stars are not an accessible form of divination by any means. Even like you said, if you're in the daytime, astrology is divination as far as I'm concerned. And the second reason that I think that is because I think that everything comes down to ancestors. And maybe like necromancy is maybe a controversial way of putting that. You could say like necromancy, ancestors, things having to do with the dead. In that, if a group of people have been practicing, or this is even what I would call tradition, right? If a group of people have been practicing something a certain way, and this practice has been handed down, over time, and I think the longer, perhaps the stronger that practice may be, not always, but oftentimes, that in itself gives something efficacy. So I think because people have been using this kind of image magic or talismanic magic in the tropical context for so long, people picking up the Picatrix and doing something in this way, that it has built up its own tradition through with its own ancestors and everything who did exactly that, and that actually gives it its own power to be able to cause an effect in the world. And I've tried both ways and more. And I think, and through my own practice, I've also, you know, that's, I guess, the third way to do it, right? Is just to try and see what works for you. And both have their own merits.
That makes a lot of sense. Um, I would be remiss to have you on the show and not talk about Jinn. I would tell everybody to go check out the episode you did on the Frightful Howls for a really wide view on Jinn. I don't want to like rehash any of that. But yeah, a lot of what I cover on the show tends to be based around my own interest in trying to figure out what my ancestors, Scotland and Ireland, might have practiced back in the day. And there's just not a whole lot of written information to try to understand what they thought. So you have mythology written down by largely Christians after the fact, but not a lot of like philosophy. Um, and so for me, I often turn to comparativism to try to contextualize what they actually might have been thinking or how they might have felt about spirits, ancestors, so on. And to me, the mythology is useful, but the relationship of what my ancestors would have had with the Aeshi, would eventually be called fairies, is probably some of the most enlightening information I think I could have about like their actual foundational religious spiritual practices. So I find the jinn, which is a really common comparison between the two types of beings, to be very vital to try to understand more. So I love having you here with a Muslim perspective. One thing that I tend to be swayed by is this perspective that what we call the Shi, and maybe by extension the jinn in a different culture, have a very foundational relationship with ancestors. And I'm curious how you feel about that.
Yeah, so that's a good starting off point to talk about the jinn in general, which I guess I've already been talking about a little bit.
Yeah.
But for Muslim people, people of that cultural framework, which, I have exposure to a lot of other cultural frameworks, once again, because of the, other side of my family and just things that I've studied and been a part of over the years. So I don't know if I'm the best example for just like the way the average Muslim thinks about the jinn. That being said, for Muslim people, the jinn are all spirits that are not angels. For one, that's a primary distinction, and actually an important distinction when you talk about like Iblis, who is like the Muslim or Arabic Satan figure, Lucifer figure. But jinn are not angels, they're not human beings, and they're, of course, not Almighty God. And that leaves a hell of a lot of room for all of the different spirit categories that people have in other cultures, just in the modern times and pop culture. Um, the example that I always use is UFOs and aliens, right? So for Muslim people, that's all jinn. Unambiguously, that's jinn. I've heard on other podcasts and from different Arabic magic scholars and workers. Pakistan is an interesting Urdu magical text, or interesting to study in this regard, because there's that proximity to India and to Hinduism and those deities. But those deities, as well as the Egyptian gods and deities in West Africa and so on and so forth, all of that is jinn as well. So the gods of other cultures are also jinn for Muslim people. They may be more powerful jinn, but they're still jinn, because once again, there's the angels, which that's a very limited group. There's only so many of them, and angels are completely subservient to God. They have no free will other than what God wills of them, which is the whole Lucifer thing. That aside, it just leaves a lot of room for other things. So aliens, UFO phenomena, all of this kind of stuff, that's all jinn. And then the other big one is the dead and the ancestors, right? So this is not to say that all Muslims believe this. And I think, like a lot of things, when you get to the ground, you're going to have cultural perspectives that are so deeply rooted that they existed before Islam even reached their lands. And I'd say if you're looking for that in full, North Africa is a pretty great obviously large region made up of many different people, but a great place to go for that kind of exposure, because there's still many practices and beliefs which clearly existed with the indigenous people of those lands before the religion ever got there. um, and Catholicism similarly, like being Mexican, it's very clear, and it's been covered by so many, all of the practices that have this Catholic overlay but go much deeper. The people who were there before the First Nations people of the Americas, before Jesus and all of that reached those lands, colonized those lands, and murdered many of those people. It's important to say. So when you get to the people who are actually like, on the land, not to just what theologians say, many of them would actually make this distinction between like a ghost or a dead person and a jinn. I've read things in Egypt, ethnographies and things where people who do spirit work and belong to transpossession groups, these kinds of things, do make this distinction. So it does exist. But by and large, if you were taking just the standard theological point, for most Muslims who don't have that kind of on-the-ground indigenous perspective, the dead are not really speaking with people for that religion. They're behind a kind of wall or a veil in the afterlife, which, when it comes time for Judgment Day, that's a different story. Somewhat similar to Christianity in that way of like, oh, well, then the gates are opened. But, until that time, it's a closed off space. And so when people do Ouija boards, when people claim to talk to the dead, or even like the experience I described at the beginning of the show, like to see something, spirit like that, what they are encountering is a jinn who is either impersonating that person, or what is called a qarin, which is essentially the jinn spirit double of that person, which gets somewhat into the idea of the genius, right? And this deeply entrenched spirit idea that goes so far back in the broader Mediterranean, right? And it's like, how can these things not be connected? The genius, the muse, the jinn. That's also something, conversation for another time. But what someone is seeing when they're seeing a dead person or hearing the voice of a dead person is that person either an impersonation by a jinn or that person's jinn double. But still, it's jinn related. It doesn't have to do with that actual spirit of that person. And so, yeah, for most Muslims, I'm not going to try to quantify it, but I would say jinn make up, all spirit phenomena that is encountered. And so that's largely how it would relate to the dead. There's more to it than just that. And if you have other questions, I'm happy to speak to it.
I did want to hammer on a point there, based on something I heard you say in a different podcast. And at one point you mentioned how in the Quran, God refers to the humans and the jinn. And your interpretation, at least in that interview, was that was God referring to the humans as an exoteric expression and the jinn as an esoteric. Do you remember that?
I think I was maybe speaking about an idea of Ibn Arabi, where he refers to something that goes beyond even just the mass conception of the jinn as jinn, and that's because Ibn Arabi was what gets called a letrist. He worked with the magic of letters and numbers, ilm al-huruf wa al-asma, Arabic, magic and numbers, which is, as I mentioned earlier, very important for the Lunar Mansions, hence why these things all go together, right, in that cosmovision. And because there's this mysticism of letters and numbers, which structures maybe all of his thought or his most important ideas, for Ibn Arabi in particular. The word jinn has the root jim, the Arabic letter jim, and nun in it, or jim, nun, nun, which Arabic words that have this root to them, all mean something which is hidden. And so it's his way of, he's he's tricky. And right, you have to remember that he's around people just like Giordano Bruno, just like, you know, so many thinkers who are just so not only ahead of their time but brilliant. He's around people who aren't going to understand what he's saying, and more so they're going to use it as a means of trying to burn him at the stake, basically. So, you know, we can't say 100% what this is in its mystical thought, but that's all jinn, because jinn are inherently esoteric, because esoteric means interior. It means on the inside, which is the same as jinn. It means it's something which is hidden from view. Another way, a way this manifests in the lunar mansions is that there is the second Arabic lunar mansion is called, one of the names is al-batin. Batin means esoteric or interior for something. But it's also the stomach, which is something which is inside the body. You can't see the stomach or the digestive processes, right? So sometimes you'll see that those stars for the second lunar mansion translated as the little belly of the ram, that ram being Aries and the stars of Aries. But that little belly is the interior. It's the batin. It's the inside of something, which is also the jinn of something. Right? So the
Yeah.
mind is jinn. And at some level, an esoteric or mystical understanding of God is also jinn. I think that's what
Mhm.
I was speaking to.
Yeah, I think that's so fascinating. Have you read much Joshua Cutchin or encountered many of his ideas?
I know who he is. I've listened to a lot of his podcasts, some even on your podcast. I haven't really read his books, but
Okay.
he's very smart, and
Yeah.
he seems to be incredibly prolific.
I was going to reference one of his books that I think you would consider his magnum opus. It's a two-part book, and the whole foundation of the book was based on a quote from Whitley Strieber's wife, Anne Strieber. And she's talking to Whitley Strieber, famous alien abductee, about his experiences and saying that perhaps all of these paranormal phenomena we experience have to do with what we call death. And his thesis is that UFO phenomenon is an outgrowth of what was once fairy belief, and that is probably an outgrowth of, at one point, some sort of conceptualization of ancestor, which might be a lot bigger than the dead alone. And I feel like sometimes if you are referring to the Shi or fairies as ancestors, some people recoil because they're like, well, no, they're not the dead. They're so much more than that. But I wonder with this conceptualization of the jinn as some sort of hidden aspect of the human, if our ancestors are somehow a manifestation of that.
Hmm.
Does that make sense? That's kind of a word salad
Yeah.
I just did.
No, no, no. I love where you're going with that. It makes me think of so
Yeah.
many things. So I'll try to
Yeah.
organize my thoughts around that, because yeah, I get very inspired when talking about these things. I think it's important what I mentioned earlier about lineage, right? And things having been done a certain way beforehand, and that having its own power too. Right? When it comes to how these kinds of phenomenon are related to, or at some level always come back to the dead. Um, I also, I don't think I said this and you had brought it up earlier, but I also very much do believe that fairies and jinn are incredibly similar to each other. If not, some people referred to them as cousins. I would even go as far to say siblings, even. But it's, part of the Quranic thinking, or the Islamic thinking around the jinn, is that they they existed before human beings on the earth. They existed before human beings. They were a creation of God. Another reason why, you have to believe in the jinn as a Muslim, because they're a creation of God. They were
Hmm.
created by God. Our same creator created them. So there's less of this kind of strong duality that you see in, I think, a lot of Christian thought. Um, they're just another of God's creations. But because they were created by our creator and occupied the earth before we did, before we were created, um, they are in some sense, and this is these are my words, this is not the words of the Quran, these are my words, but at some level they are our ancestors, right? They would be form that kind of lineage of our bodies. And thinkers like Ibn Arabi, or especially Ibn Arabi, talked about this elemental breakdown. And so jinn were thought to be of fire and air,
Mm.
especially, and human beings are thought to be of water and earth. So if you're talking about the inside and outside, water and earth are like more solid in that way and kind of visible, and air and fire are more invisible and ethereal. So that's kind of that same distinction you were talking about earlier. But they were here on these same lands before we were, and at some level that makes them our ancestors. Something I've studied a lot of indigenous cultures and their ideas about paranormal phenomena, especially related to stars and whatnot, for what I've done with my astrological practice in different classes I've taught. And many indigenous people see UFOs, lights in the sky, these kinds of things, and they refer to them as ancestors, in the same way that they might refer to a large rock formation on the land as an ancestor, as plants and animals as ancestors. This is something you see especially in indigenous cultures, where it's not just human beings that are ancestors, right? And so not only is it just stars, rocks, plants, but also, beings, even beings that we don't see readily as also being ancestors, ones who have dwelled alongside us. And even many of these same cultures, once a human being dies, there is the very real possibility of transformation into one of these beings after they have entered the afterlife, right? So a human being in the afterlife can actually become one of these beings, like a jinn, like a fairy. Which would also add to it's an ancestor, but it's not that same human that we once knew. They've been changed since they entered the land of the dead. And many of these same cultures, they don't have this many worlds distinction for the other world. Like your podcast is very much about the other world, right? Many cultures, it's this world and then it's the other world. That's it. There's the visible world and the invisible world. And everything in the invisible world is not necessarily homogeneous, but it all partakes of one world. So the land of the dead and the land of the jinn or the fairies is already one and the same, because they both exist in the invisible dimension. They may not be the same creature, like in some kind of like taxonomical way, but they exist on the same plane, which is the invisible plane, if you do like a invisible visible distinction, which many cultures do.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I guess the last thing I'll say is that I haven't read much Joshua Cutchin, but I have read Jacques Vallée, and I'm very much a Jacques. I'm very much a Vallean. I don't know, what do they call people who believe agree with what Jacques Vallée said, which
You're
is
a
that,
jock stan.
yeah, a Jacques stan. That fairies, jinn, this phenomena is essentially the same as the UFO abduction phenomena and all of that. 100%. I'm in that camp. So,
Yeah, that's fascinating. Well, I want to take a little time to do a Patreon segment, but before we do that, if you want to go ahead and give any plugs or updates or where people can follow you, find you, now's the time.
sure. So the jinn in the room, or the elephant in the room, is I've publicly left my astrological practice. I've been a professional astrologer for the past 5 or 6 years now, as well as publishing pretty heavily in that world, but also the magic world. And I'm going on to new things, to other projects, different things. And so my kind of like Star Night Dwell, if you could even call it a platform that I had at one point, is being phased out in my life, not for any negative reasons. Honestly, I'm just going through changes in my own life, and not bad things, but I think it's just time. That being said, at some later point, I may still, I have another book I think that I want to write, which is sort of in the astrology camp. So without saying too much about that, if you do want to follow my esoteric work, magical work, astrological work, you can just hop on the free tier on my Patreon. You don't have to pay money. There's a free tier on there. If you do want to hop on the paid tier, it's just $7 a month. I'm not really going to be posting there anymore, but if you just want to like do a 1 month quick donation or something, or I have a bunch of things behind the paywall on my Patreon, articles that I've written on the Jinn, on magic, on a lot of fixed star and lunar mansion stuff and astrology. You can hop on there. But yeah, at some point down the line, I may post a few things on there. So that's the best way to follow me and keep up with my work. I pretty much got off Instagram and my website. So yeah, hit me up on Patreon or send me an email, starnightdwell@gmail.com. That's the best way to contact me. But yeah, that's about it.
Beautiful. You can hear more of my conversation with Jay over on our Patreon, where we explore some of the pitfalls of the contemporary astrological scene and wider culture. Jay also expands on his personal definition of witchcraft and its Gnostic essence. And just in time for the spooky season, Jay gives us a long list of Lunar Mansion and horror movie pairings to both entertain and enlighten you about the poetic essence of these fascinating stations. The link to the Patreon is in the show notes. Thank you.